And so today I chose to talk about dissociable biases in orientation recall. And this is actually a project for which I collected the data a long time ago. And it's one of those ones that kind of sits on the back burner. You never kind of write up, but I'm actually really excited about it and want to get back into this. And so that's why, again, I'm presenting it today. And I hope to get some input or feedback or questions or anything that you might feel is appropriate. But I'm going to start pretty high level by just giving you kind of the framework. So I'm going to ask you to hold this image in mind. And this image happens to be the Brandenburger Tor, which is in Berlin, Germany, which is where I live now. So it seems appropriate. And I'm going to take it away. And then after a short delay, I'm going to ask you to recall it to say if this is the same or a different Brandenburger Tor, for example. And you'll notice that you did it, right? You all were able to remember this image, have some kind of visual memory of it. And it seemed very easy, probably, to do this task. But I want to highlight that in everyday life, this is actually not such a trivial task as it might seem. So one of the things that happens, of course, is that we as people ourselves move through the world. So both our eyes are moving, which is illustrated in this little video. So the white circle is where the fixation is, if you were looking, let's say, at this image. And the little circle, the little video in the upper right corner is what is actually being perceived on the retina, right? So constantly, this image on the retina is shifting. We're moving through the world with our eyes and with our bodies as well. So we're constantly moving and our visual perception is constantly shifting. And to make matters worse, let's say you want to know at which metro station you are, and you were trying to read that, and you may have had some visual image of it, but now there is this subway or this metro that's coming by, and you have to remember this visual information, even though it's no longer available to you in the outside world. All right. So the main point that I'm really trying to make here is that working memory is really the central workspace of the mind that is there to support these behavioral goals that we have from moment to moment, right? It needs to do so both flexibly as well as robustly. So really, visual working memory is this core cognitive ability. For example, visual working memory capacity is a strong predictor of general intelligence. And as such, it needs to be flexible, adaptive to the circumstances, and robust to, let's say, interference of things that are happening in the environment and decay over time, et cetera, et cetera. All right, and so I want to sort of go into another example where I'm trying to set up a little bit the framework of what I'm going to tell today in a real world situation. So imagine there was a crime, there's a lineup, and now you have to remember the face or some of the traits of the perpetrator, right? Now, there's this phenomenon that's called verbal overshadowing, which means that describing a memory actually reduces its fidelity. And so what do we see when people have to do a task like this in the real world? They start, if you have, let's say, no delay between the incident and when people have to describe a perpetrator, people will give really defining characteristics, such as that the perpetrator had piercing green eyes, a sharp nose, etc., right? But if you then ask the same question again 20 minutes later, people will describe the perpetrator in more general terms. For example, that it was a white male, had brown hair, and it becomes a little bit more abstract, this descriptor. Now, I've actually done some work in the lab, which is sort of your best case scenario, right? So in this case, there's no crime. People are just sitting comfortably behind a chair and they have to remember a face. But even when they do that, what you see is that if you plot the memory error, and here it runs from small to large, over, let's say, just an empty, uninterrupted delay, you already see that there is some precision loss in working memory, right? You can do this for other types of stimuli as well, such as, let's say, a color or an orientation. And so this is not a huge disaster, I would say, because the decay rate is low and working memory is still fairly robust, right? But there is this sort of movement away over time, at least, from very specific, highly detailed memories to something that becomes a little bit more noisy. All right. So with the idea of verbal overshadowing, or the example of verbal overshadowing, what it shows is that it's really just loss in detail and more reliance on a heuristic over time, right? So when we talk about detailed representation, we think of something that's really high resolution, really sensory-like, and over time, then this becomes somewhat more abstract. Right? What do we mean with this abstract representation now? Something that's, let's say, low resolution, right? More of a category, perhaps, or an action. Let's say a button you want to press, or the lunch you want to have. All right. So, but what I want to show today is that these detailed and abstract representations are connected to each other, where abstract representations can actually constrain or frame the more detailed representation or provide a context for them. All right. And all of this, of course, is for the purpose of supporting behavioral goals flexibly and robustly. All right. So I want to step a little bit closer to a very prominent idea currently in the neuroimaging literature. But this is actually a quote by William James, who said that the same cerebral processes, which when aroused from without by a sense organ, gives the perception of an object, will give an idea of the same object when aroused by other cerebral processes from within, right? So I've highlighted sort of the important parts that the same cerebral processes, right, that give rise to perception, give rise to an idea. And the way we know this now in neuroimaging literature, and also to some extent in other literatures, is the sensory recruitment theory of working memory. And so the idea is that you have a high level behavioral goal, such as remember a face, and that you will recruit an area of the brain that has the capability of having very detailed representation, such as visual cortex. And so in this case, you might recruit visual cortex if you're trying to remember a face of a friend. And that's basically the sensory recruitment hypothesis, similar as was framed on the previous slide, right? And so this is really a prevailing theory of working memory at the moment. It's proven very useful. But as I already hopefully primed you to think, is that, well, there's actually more to this than these really highly detailed representations, because there's also more abstract high-level representations, right? So you might, in this case, just remember, instead of this face really with detail, you might just say, oh, well, that was John. Or you might have some kind of abstract, reduced idea of a face, which is two dots and a mouth. So I will come back to this schematic later. But for now, I really want to just highlight that I want to really investigate these interactions between these highly detailed and more abstract representations, how they impact each other. And I'll use the visual system as a model system. It's this big patch of cortex, right? The organization of it is fairly well known. We know the tuning properties. And so that's what I'll be talking about, a visual system as sort of a model system. And more specifically, I'll be talking about visual memory for orientation as a model system here. So again, I'll give a very high level description of what these kinds of tasks usually look like. So as a subject, right, you would be looking at the little circle in the middle. Then you're shown an orientation and you're supposed to remember that over a delay. And then at the end of the delay, you get, let's say, a little dial like this, which you can rotate to match the orientation that you had remembered. Now, of course, what we can do next is go back to the original grading that we showed and calculate the error between your response and between the orientation that you were supposed to remember. Now, when we look at the amount of errors that, or the frequency with which subjects make errors, you have a distribution that looks kind of like this. So most of the time, people are pretty good, right? So their most frequent error is probably 0 degrees. But there's, of course, some noise around their responses that we can measure. And so that is the standard deviation of such a distribution, circular standard deviation in this case. But we can also look at the mean of that distribution, right? And again, the reason now I'm using orientation is because it's fairly well understood. It's a really simple stimulus feature, it's controllable, and it does require a detailed recall to do this kind of task. All right, so that's most of the introduction, I hope. And so the main question that I want to ask here is, do detailed and abstract levels of representation interact with one another? Using orientation, of course. All right. So first, I want to give you a little summary of these sort of well-known distortions in orientation recall. And here I'm going to give a very high-level summary, but I'll explain that a little bit more in detail as well. So on the left, what you see is one distortion that we call the oblique effect. And that basically means that people are better at discriminating and or reporting orientations that are around vertical and horizontal, so cardinal. And they're worse at discriminating and or recalling, right, orientations that are at oblique orientations. And so this is really, and that's important, an effect on the standard deviation of these distributions we just saw. Then the second distortion that has been fairly well studied now, a little bit less well known, is a repulsion bias. And this is really an effect on the mean of the distribution. And what this means is that if you have an orientation that is close to vertical or horizontal, people will exaggerate its tilt away from those axes. So what's important here is that previous work has really assumed that these biases stem from a common mechanism. And what I'll hopefully show you today is that that's probably not the case. Okay, so why are these things happening, right? Why do we have this oblique effect, for example? So the idea here is that it originates from visual scene statistics, and it's rather hardwired. This is, happens to be the San Diego skyline. And if we call this, let's say, a visual context or a visual scene in which, you know, orientations obviously exist, you might see that there's a lot of vertical orientations as well as a lot of horizontal orientations. And this is not only true for the San Diego skyline, right, but this is largely true for most of the visual input that people get from day to day, and both over the course of their individual development as well as over the course of the evolutionary development of the human species. All right. So I'll expand a little bit more on this first bias that I told you about, which is the oblique effect. And I'll have you do a little demo. So I will show you two orientations, and you have to say if they are the same or different. All right, so here they come.
Different.
Different. Okay, I'll do the same thing again. Here come two orientations, same or different.
Same.
Yeah, so they're also different. And what's more, these two examples were equally different. So both of them were 5 degrees apart. The first two, however, were different around a cardinal axis, and the second two were different around an oblique axis. And so this is a really striking demonstration, which usually works for most people, and so I hope it works for you as well, in that, you know, your resolution around these cardinal axes is just a lot higher. And so what does this look like in this recall data? So this general task outline that I demonstrated before. Now on the y-axis, we have the standard deviation. And on the x-axis, we have the target orientation. And so what happens is if you have a target orientation around one of these cardinal axes, the standard deviation is much lower, which means this distribution is much narrower. And therefore, the recall performance is much more precise. When people have to recall an orientation that was around these oblique axes, you see that the standard deviation goes up, and therefore their behavior is just noisier at those orientations. All right, the second bias, and I think this already goes to show that, you know, it's kind of a slightly different creature. The second bias, I don't have a very strong demo for you to show, so you'll just have to take my word for it. In this case, is that if I show you this orientation, what will happen if people report it, they will exaggerate its tilt a little bit clockwise in this case. If I show you this orientation, again, the same thing might happen, right? People will exaggerate its orientation away from this cardinal axis, in this case, in a counterclockwise orientation. All right, so a real world example that I could think of is that, let's say you're standing in front of the Tower of Pisa and you have to estimate this angle of its tilt. So why does it seem so tilted? You might then estimate this angle as being actually larger than what it is. So what does this look like in data? Now on the y-axis, I'm plotting the mean of the distribution. So this is, again, a different metric, right? And so what you see here is this sawtooth pattern with, when the orientation is a little bit clockwise, you see that there's an exaggerated mean clockwise response. Whereas if the grading is slightly counterclockwise from a cardinal axis, you see this exaggeration in a counterclockwise direction. All right. So we kind of come back to this point, which I made earlier, is that these two are assumed to stem from a common mechanism. And so the idea here is that visual cortex is really adapt to processing horizontal and vertical orientations. And this is really what's causing both the oblique effect and the repulsion effect. And so really explicitly, they're saying, a previous paper have posited, a beautiful model actually is saying that, well, you have better discriminability at cardinal, and therefore you will have repulsion from cardinal. And this is a very parsimonious account. As I said, a really beautiful model is generated from first principles. And it's really based also on vision. But what it ignores is this more abstract cognition, this framing that people do. And as I was already showing you earlier with that, I can really easily show and demonstrate the oblique effect, but I cannot as easily show you this repulsion effect. I've also had subjects in the past who have, instead of a repulsion effect, suddenly an attraction effect. There's not many, but they exist. So this bias doesn't seem quite as reliable. And so what we really wanted to do is have a critical test of this hypothesis. Is it true that these biases are really constrained by the architecture of visual cortex or not? And so what is this critical test? So this is work I've done in the lab of John Sorensis with my collaborator Chaipat Chunharas, who is now in Bangkok. And what we wanted to do was to disentangle retinal and real world coordinate frames. And this might sound somewhat wonky, but it's really, really super simple. So the idea here is that usually in real life, our heads are upright, right? And vertical and horizontal, and let's say 0 and 90 degrees are the same. So the retinal coordinates and the real world coordinates are the same. But if these biases are actually not connected to each other, you might be able to disentangle them by simply having subjects rotate their head 45 degrees. And this is exactly what we did here. So I have in teal here, vertical and horizontal. I hope that people can see my mouse because otherwise I'm moving it for nothing. Okay, good. And I plot here in black, in these black dotted lines, the retinal coordinate frame. And so really what you do by having subjects tilt their head is you tease these two apart. And this will become, I hope, much more intuitive once I show a little bit more the idea and the data as well. All right, so the task is about as simple and as boring as can be. So subjects sit in a dark room, they look at a CRT monitor. They're shown a target orientation, which is a random orientation between 1 and 180, actually in 3-degree steps. Then there is a 1.5 second delay. And then after the delay, they rotate this dial by pressing some buttons similar to what I showed before. All right, and we had subjects do this extensively. So they did 5 days of testing because we wanted to collect actually a lot of data at each individual orientation that we show. And so I do need to acknowledge my undergraduate RAs who were heroic in the effort of collecting all the data that I will show, which is a lot. And of course, also acknowledge these poor subjects because we tortured them quite a bit, as you will see next. All right, so I want to start by showing you this example subject. And I'll also just start by having the subject's head upright. So here in black, this is a little icon indicating the head tilt condition. And in this case, the subject is upright. And what I want to show you here is really the raw data and what this looks like. So each dot here is a single trial. You can see that, we collected quite a few trials. On the y-axis, I'm plotting the absolute error. And on the x-axis, I'm plotting the target orientation. And what's important is that this target orientation is in a retinal coordinate frame. So this is the orientation as the eyes perceive it, okay? And that will be the same throughout. Now I'm also, again, plotting this teal here with V stands for vertical and H stands for horizontal. And in this case, 0 degree is vertical, and then we move clockwise, which I understand is the wrong way, but that's how Toolbox taught it to. All right. So now we can do 2 things, right, with this error distribution or these errors that we have. First is we can determine at each orientation the standard deviation. And so this is the amount of variability at each orientation that subjects had to remember. And then I made this nice little diagram here, which is a little bit of a smoothed image of smoothing the data and showing you kind of what this looks like when you look at the amount of variability in subject responses as a function of orientation. Long story short, this is just your classic oblique effect, where you see that in this particular individual subject, right? And so this is why we require so much data. Estimating standard deviation is a little bit data hungry. You see that there's this double bump here. So people are better at these cardinal orientations, and they're worse at this oblique orientation. So the second summary statistic is the mean. This is a little bit more stable. And what you see, and you kind of already see this, right? Well, not kind of, you quite clearly see this in the raw data, is that there is a sort of double bump. And when you quantify that for each degree of orientation that the subject was seeing, you see the sawtooth pattern that I showed before as well. Okay, so that's your repulsion effect. So now what happens when we have the subject's head tilted? And so this is the icon for the subject's head when it's tilted 45 degrees. You'll see again on the x-axis, right? So this is the orientation on the retina, but now you see that this horizontal and this vertical line are shifted, because when you tilt your head 45 degrees, vertical is now 45 degrees in the other direction. Of course, this depends on the direction of tilt, which was, by the way, counterbalanced across subjects. All right, so first we look again at the standard deviation, at the oblique effect. And we know that this oblique effect is really a function of, how many neurons are dedicated to cardinal. And this really shouldn't change when you tilt your head, because all of a sudden, right, your neurons are not going to respond to 45 degrees. They're still going to respond more strongly, or you're still going to have more that are dedicated to cardinal axes. So again, you see this double bump here with the best performance, smallest standard deviation at the cardinal axes, and more noisier responses or at the oblique orientations. But now, of course, I wouldn't be presenting you this data if this wasn't something super interesting, because once you look at the mean of subjects' responses, in this particular example subject, what you see is that this sawtooth is entirely shifted. So it's shifted by 45 degrees. And now the repulsion is actually away from real world vertical and horizontal. And it's no longer tied to the retinal coordinate frame at all. So it turns out that when you tilt your head 45 degrees, if you were going to say this thing is like a little bit wonky, such as the Tower of Pisa, it would still look more tilted probably than it really is, no matter how you tilt your head. All right, and I hope that I can convince you even further by showing you the data across all of the subjects. So what we have here now is the data for 12 subjects, and that means that I no longer have to smooth or do anything now. Each dot here is an orientation that was presented, and that's 720 trials of this orientation being presented to all these people, all right? So what you see here is that if you have a subject with a head upright or a subject with a head tilted, this typical characteristic oblique effect shape is really quite similar and really tracks the retinal coordinate frame. You might notice that people are a little bit noisier when their head is tilted. This is absolutely possible, I think, because we had some subjects tilt counterclockwise, some subjects tilt clockwise. They did have to use a mouse. Actually, yeah, sorry, they didn't use button presses, they used a mouse to indicate their response. So you might expect that the responses in general are a little bit noisier, but overall, this shape is really tracking regardless of their head tilt. Instead now, if we look at the mean of their responses, so the bias, if you overlap those two, what you see is a clear shift of 45 degrees of this bias, which really shows you that this bias is anchored to the real world coordinate frame. All right, and I want to show you just some other quirks of the data, which I think are very cool. So the nice thing about having so many trials at each orientation is that you can also look at the actual error distributions at different orientations. So what I'm showing you now is the error distribution across all of our subjects for 90 and 180 degrees, so for vertical and horizontal exactly. And you see that these are really, really peaked. And if we compare those, for example, with the distributions at the oblique axis, so 45 and 135, you see that they are much, much noisier. Now, the more interesting thing perhaps is to see what is really happening when subjects' responses are so biased. Do we see just a sort of uniform shift of this distribution, or do we see something else? And it turns out that we see something quite different. So these arrows now indicate the orientation that subjects were viewing. And you see that it's almost like a distribution that kind of got chopped off. So their responses are very skewed. So they will they're very unlikely to give a response that's on the wrong side of cardinal, basically. And so this is something that we would like to explain in the future through modeling. But this is not just a shift in their mean. There's really something more complicated going on. All right. Now, you might ask, and I think Jan is already thinking about this, I can see it, but your subjects are sitting in a dark room and they have this bright gray, mean gray screen in front of them that has clear, vertical and horizontal lines, which of course subjects might use as a reference frame to remember the orientations.
That's exactly the question I had written down, actually. That's no joke.
Yeah, I saw it. So yeah, but this is of course, a very natural way to think, and we thought that the same. So we wanted to at least take that context, that very explicit context away, because it's right there in the room. So what we did is we used an Oculus Rift. This is a little, screen that goes entirely around the face. And then we made a little circular aperture inside of the Oculus so that now the screen is really just a round screen, and the rest of it is black. So subjects really kind of have no sense of, at least visually, no sense of what is vertical and what is horizontal anymore. And the task otherwise is exactly the same. So they see this target orientation, it's random, they remember it, and then they give their response. So now if we look at these data, again, we start with the oblique effect. If the oblique effect is hardwired, which we believe it is, there is no reason to suspect that the data would look any different with or without context. And if we overlay, again, these data, this is indeed more or less what we see. Right, so now if this repulsion effect is really tied into the oblique effect, then we would expect it to look similar to what we saw in the first experiment as well. And this turns out not to be the case. So now if we overlay the data, we see that there is still a repulsion effect to some extent, right? But it's much reduced and much noisier than what we saw in the first experiment. So it does look like if you remove this visual context directly, this repulsion bias is not quite as strong. Of course, like we cannot put, we probably could actually, but we did not put people in some kind of sensory deprivation room, right? They still have cues, they're still sitting at a table, they're still having gravity and things like that. So they might still be able to orient themselves in space to some extent. So we wouldn't expect to remove this bias entirely, but it is, when you take the visual cues away, much reduced. And again, I want to show you some cool unexpected and also unintended quirks of the data. So when we did this first Oculus experiment, and there are some more which I'm not going to talk about today, but when we did this first one, we saw this little nugget in our data, which is that when subjects get to respond, they, for the life of them, don't ever want to say that the orientation was exactly vertical or exactly horizontal. And it turns out when you have an Oculus Rift and the pixels are this close to your face, they can see. So when they rotate the line to exactly vertical, they can tell it's exactly vertical. And so it turns out that subjects don't like doing this. And so there's this really strong, for whatever reason, I think it's rather a high level reason, but subjects refuse to say that the orientation was exactly vertical or exactly horizontal. All right, then this is a slide I will need some time to unpack, and I usually don't even quite understand it myself. so hopefully we'll walk through this. So what I did is I quantified the amount of bias. So that's here on the x-axis, or the amount of repulsion bias, I should say. So how strongly are people showing this repulsion away from the cardinal axes? And if this number is very large, they have a very strong repulsion bias, right? And if this number is very small, they're quite veridical in their response. And then on the y-axis, I quantify two things about the oblique effect. So first of all, what I want to quantify is how noisy are their responses in general. So how how one subject might, on average be 3 degrees off, whereas another subject on average might be 10 degrees off, right? So this is what I'm quantifying here. And then what I'm quantifying here is sort of the strength of the oblique effect. So if a subject has a really strong oblique effect, then they're much, much better at cardinal than they are at obliques. Whereas if a subject doesn't have a very strong oblique effect, then this would look relatively flat. And again, their noise is sort of equal across the orientation space. Okay, so the first thing I want to point out in these data, and this is just experiment 1 here on the left and experiment 2 here on the right, and you see that, the data patterns look quite similar. So this is good, totally different set of subjects. So the first thing to notice here is that when you now look at this black line, which is the upright condition, and the dotted line here, which is the tilted condition, is that there's a general increase in the noisiness of their responses. And I kind of pointed this out earlier as well. This can be explained, for example, which seems quite straightforward, by the fact that tilting your head for quite some time on end is uncomfortable and, might inhibit your motor response a little bit to some extent. So that's certainly something that we see. So subject responses become noisier when their head is tilted. The other thing you can see here is this sort of positive positive relationship between how noisy subject responses are and how large their repulsion bias is. So subjects that give overall noisier responses usually also tend to have a larger repulsion bias. Now, this is where things get tricky, right? So here we thought about this a lot, like what's happening here. So subjects with a really strong oblique effect, they tend to have not a lot of repulsion bias when their head is upright. And subjects with not so strong of an oblique effect, they have a stronger repulsion bias, which would indicate that these subjects might have some kind of meta-awareness or something of that, okay, in this part of the orientation space, right, I know that I'm really, really good. My resolution is high, so I don't need to have quite this bias away from here. Yes, I hear someone.
I heard someone too, but I don't think it was a question.
Okay, that's fine. All right. So there seems to be this relationship between how strong someone's oblique effect is and the extent of the repulsion. Now, the interesting thing happens is when they tilt their head is that this relationship flips. So now their high resolution part of the space is not in the part where the bias is anymore. That all sounds very hand wavy, but bear with me. So when subjects tilt their head, now all of a sudden, the door frame, which might be upright, is in another part of this space where they know they have a low resolution. And so therefore, it seems that there's this uncoupling of the bias. Now the high resolution part of their orientation space is somewhere else, and therefore the bias actually goes up for these people that have a very strong oblique effect. But this is certainly something that is puzzling us, and we're trying to explain it. And ideally, of course, we would like to come up with a beautiful, comprehensive model that explains all of these things, including like little quirks of the data. But that's something that's kind of the next step that we're hoping to take. All right. So to summarize, it looks like there's this reference frame, which in this case, is horizontal and vertical, something as simple as that. And this is really used to anchor memories or anchor reports. And this seems to be happening independently from these low-level sensory effects. So this repulsion bias might be something that could increase over time as people are remembering an orientation for longer. And so these reference frames seem to have a really important role. The other thing I think is very kind of quirky and interesting about these data is that people actually use this high-level knowledge, for example, to avoid very specific responses, as we saw in the case of this really strong cardinal averse responses when people have to replicate this orientation. So it doesn't seem all that high level when you talk about this repulsion bias. All right, so I wanted to come back to this sensory recruitment is where we started. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that memory is not a passive snapshot. And I think the reality should look something a little bit more like this, where these two are based on independent mechanisms, right? So these abstract representations and this reference frame really matter, but it also constrains the detailed representation and vice versa. So they interact in people's behavioral outputs.